It was a warm Thursday evening when Agent Maria Mitchell finished her long shift at the FBI office. She had been working on an important case all day, reviewing files, conducting interviews, and piecing together crucial information. After a day full of meetings and hours of research, Maria was looking forward to a quiet drive home. She had earned this moment of peace. Little did she know, the calm she expected would soon be interrupted by an unexpected and unsettling encounter. Married to her career, Maria had always been dedicated to ensuring justice was served, no matter how long it took. As a black woman in law enforcement, she had faced her own set of challenges, but she had never let those challenges stop her from excelling in her work. She was proud of what she had accomplished, knowing that her hard work had earned her respect from her colleagues at the FBI. But today, as she drove down the familiar streets of her neighborhood, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something that would challenge everything she had worked for. The city's streets were less crowded than usual, and the evening air was calm. Maria's car glided along the road, her mind still occupied with the case she had been working on. The rhythmic sound of her tires on the pavement was soothing. But just as she turned onto her block, the quiet was shattered by the flashing lights of a police car in her rearview mirror. Maria's heart skipped a beat. She knew exactly what this was. Another traffic stop. She was no stranger to being pulled over, though it had been a while since she'd been stopped while off duty. Still, she knew the drill. She slowed her car and pulled over to the side of the road, wondering if this was just another case of a minor traffic infraction. As the officer approached her car, Maria rolled down the window, trying to remain calm. She had dealt with similar situations before and knew how to keep things professional. She could see that the officer was a middle-aged white man, tall and broad-shouldered, with a serious expression on his face. He wore the typical blue uniform, and his badge gleamed in the streetlight. He stood by her window, checking her vehicle's license plate before looking up at her. "Good evening, ma'am," the officer said, his tone firm. "I stopped you for speeding. Can I see your driver's license and registration, please?" Married to the rules and procedures of law enforcement, Maria immediately handed over her information. She had nothing to hide, and she had always kept her driving record clean. There was no reason for concern, at least that's what she hoped. However, the officer's demeanor seemed different. He was polite, but there was a tension in his voice, and his eyes lingered on her face for just a moment too long. Maria had been stopped many times before in her career, both in uniform and off-duty, but something about this stop felt different. It wasn't just the simple exchange of information. It was the way he was looking at her, as if something about her presence made him uneasy. As the officer took a moment to check her details on his radio, Maria couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. She could feel the officer's eyes on her through the side mirror, and the air between them was thick with an unspoken tension. She knew she was being judged, not just for the infraction he had stopped her for, but for the simple fact that she was a black woman driving through a neighborhood where she knew she didn't quite belong in the eyes of some people. A few minutes passed before the officer returned to her car with an even more serious expression. The situation was starting to feel strange, and Maria could sense that something was off. She had never been treated like this during a routine stop. His hands were shaking slightly as he handed her documents back, and there was a pause before he spoke again. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step out of the car," Officer Harris said, his voice lower than before. "There's something I need to check." Maria was taken aback. This wasn't a common request during a regular traffic stop, and she felt a rush of confusion and concern. As an FBI agent, she knew that protocols had to be followed in every situation. What had started as a simple stop now felt like something far more serious. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, trying to maintain her composure while her mind raced to understand what was happening. The officer hesitated for a moment, his eyes flickering back to his patrol car before looking at her again. "Just step out of the car, ma'am, please." Maria stepped out of her car, her mind racing with questions. She had been stopped for a routine traffic violation before, but something about this situation felt wrong. The officer's demeanor had shifted, and it wasn't the usual friendly, professional exchange she was accustomed to. As she closed the door behind her, she noticed Officer Harris wasn't standing as straight as before. He seemed uneasy, almost as if he was unsure of how to proceed. The night air felt colder as she stood on the sidewalk, glancing briefly at the officer. She knew the drill. As an FBI agent, she was used to high-pressure situations and could read people well. This officer, however, was different. His nervousness was palpable, and Mariah couldn't understand why. She tried to keep her expression neutral, but internally, she was alert, prepared for whatever might come next. "Is everything okay, officer?" she asked, keeping her tone calm but firm. Officer Harris hesitated for a moment. "I need to run a quick check on you," he said, his voice shaky. He turned toward his patrol car, his hand reaching for his radio, but his eyes darted back to Mariah, clearly unsure whether he should continue. Mariah stood still, trying to assess the situation. She could feel the weight of the moment and the odd tension that hung in the air. Something was off, but she couldn't figure out what. In her line of work, she was used to handling situations where emotions ran high or when tensions were thick, but she had never felt like this during a routine stop before. The officer had mentioned a check, but she couldn't understand why it was needed for something as minor as speeding. Minutes passed before Officer Harris returned to her side. His face was flushed, and his posture was more rigid than before. Mariah could tell he was trying to hide his anxiety, but it wasn't working. As he walked back to her, his eyes avoided hers, and for the first time, she could see that he wasn't just doing his job. He was on edge. "Ma'am, I'm sorry for the confusion," he said, his voice low. "It turns out there's a problem with your ID. I'm going to need to check something further." His words were rushed, as though he were trying to cover up something he didn't want to explain fully. Mariah raised an eyebrow. This was the moment she had been anticipating. She had kept her composure so far, but now the situation was becoming more serious than a simple traffic stop. "There's no issue with my ID, officer. I've been through this process before." Officer Harris stepped back slightly, looking at her with a sense of reluctance. "I'm just following procedure, ma'am. Please bear with me for a moment." As he spoke, Mariah's mind raced. She knew her ID would check out. She had nothing to hide, and as an FBI agent, her credentials were spotless. But something about the officer's actions was making her uneasy. He seemed to be stalling. She decided it was time to take control of the situation. "Officer Harris," she said, her voice steady. "I'm an FBI agent. My identification should be more than enough to verify who I am. So if there's any confusion, I'd appreciate it if we could resolve this quickly. I've been stopped for a minor violation, and I expect this to be handled professionally." The officer's eyes widened for a moment as the words FBI agent registered in his mind. It was clear now. He had no idea who she was when he first stopped her. His face shifted from anxious to surprise, as though a weight had just been lifted off his shoulders. "I'm terribly sorry, ma'am," Officer Harris said, now visibly flustered. "I didn't realize. I didn't recognize you. I should have checked the name first. Please forgive me for any inconvenience." Mariah couldn't help but feel the shift in the situation. She had expected an apology, but the officer's behavior told a different story. She had dealt with her fair share of awkward moments in law enforcement, but this one was different. There was more to this stop than just a simple mistake on his part. "It's all right, officer," Mariah replied, her voice calm but firm. "But you need to understand that making assumptions like that is not acceptable, especially when you're dealing with someone who works in the field of law enforcement. It's important that every citizen is treated fairly and with respect." Officer Harris nodded quickly, seemingly embarrassed by his actions. "You're absolutely right, ma'am. I should have recognized your name when I ran the plates. There's no excuse for how I handled this." At that moment, Officer Carter, The second officer, who had been with Harris at the scene, approached. She had been watching the exchange from a distance and now stepped forward, taking charge of the situation. "I'm sorry for the delay, ma'am," she said. "We've confirmed your credentials and there's no further issue. We apologize for the inconvenience." As Mariah continued her drive home, the unsettling feeling from the traffic stop still lingered in her mind. She had been pulled over for a minor violation, which was nothing out of the ordinary. But the way the situation had unfolded, first with the hesitation of Officer Harris, then the sudden recognition of her identity, made her feel uncomfortable. It was clear that something had shifted in the officer's behavior once he realized who she was. Maria knew she had to think carefully about the events that had just transpired. As an FBI agent, she had been through countless situations where professionalism and composure were required. But this time, it wasn't just about handling the stop with grace. It was about understanding why the situation had escalated the way it did. She had spent years working in law enforcement, earning the respect of her peers, and advancing through the ranks. Yet, in this simple interaction with two police officers, she was reminded of the ways people could be treated differently based on assumptions, biases, or a lack of understanding. Maria knew that she wasn't the only one who had faced this kind of treatment, but it hit her differently now that she had been on the other side of the interaction. Driving through the quiet streets, Mariah's thoughts turned inward. What had she just experienced? The fact that the officers had treated her with a sense of caution, even after realizing who she was, left her questioning not only how she was perceived in that moment, but also the broader implications of such interactions. She thought about the many people in her community who didn't have the privilege of being recognized or having the badge that came with authority. How many others had faced similar situations where the color of their skin or their background made them feel less than, or worse, treated unfairly. Maria had worked hard to climb the ranks of the FBI. She had broken barriers, and her dedication to serving the community had earned her the opportunity to lead important cases. But now she couldn't shake the thought that maybe she had been shielded by her position in ways others weren't. What if she had been just another black woman driving through a neighborhood, stopped by a police officer who didn't recognize her? Would the situation have played out the same way? As she approached her home, Mariah turned the engine off, but the thoughts in her head refused to quiet. She stepped out of the car and made her way into the house, but the questions from the traffic stop continued to haunt her. This was a small incident, yes, but it was also a reflection of a much larger problem. Inside, Emily, Mariah's wife, was sitting in the living room reading a book. She looked up as Mariah entered the room, sensing immediately that something was on her mind. "Hey, how was the drive?" Emily asked, setting the book down and looking at her. "It was fine," Mariah replied, though her voice lacked its usual ease. She paused for a moment, taking a deep breath before sitting down beside Emily. "I got pulled over. It was just a routine stop, but something felt off about it." Emily gave her a concerned look. What happened? Married to a life of law enforcement, Emily had always been understanding of the pressures and challenges that came with the job. But Mariah could see that her wife was picking up on her discomfort, and she didn't want to hide the truth. This wasn't just about the stop. It was about something deeper. "It wasn't the stop itself," Mariah said, her voice steady but filled with a sense of frustration. "It's how the officer acted when he realized who I was. At first he was just doing his job, but when he ran my plates and saw my name, it was like everything changed. Suddenly, he was nervous, cautious. I could feel the shift in his behavior." Emily's brow furrowed. "That's strange. Was he rude or dismissive?" "No," Mariah said quickly. "Not exactly. He was polite, even apologetic afterward, but I could sense the discomfort in him. And it wasn't just about the stop. It was how he responded to me once he knew who I was. It made me wonder if that's how people like me, people of color, are treated when others don't know who we are. How much of it is just assumed, based on appearance?" Emily took Mariah's hand, squeezing it gently. "I know what you mean, and it's not right. But what are you going to do about it?" Maria paused. She hadn't thought about it yet, But she realized that Emily was right. This was not just something she could brush off. It was a reminder of the work that still needed to be done, not only in law enforcement, but in society as a whole. The system wasn't perfect, and if she wanted to continue making a real difference, she needed to address these uncomfortable truths head-on. The next morning, Maria woke up early, her mind buzzing with thoughts of the previous evening's conversation. As she sipped her coffee, she reflected on everything that had happened since the traffic stop. She had always prided herself on her ability to stay calm in high-pressure situations, but last night had shaken her. The officer's reaction to her identity had caused her to think deeper about the assumptions people made, the biases they carried, and how those biases affected everyone, not just in law enforcement, but in every aspect of society. Maria had always been a fighter, someone who believed that change was possible, even in a system as deeply ingrained as law enforcement. But now, she felt more determined than ever to take action. She couldn't let this feeling go. It wasn't enough to just be aware of the problem. She had to do something about it. She knew that the first step was to have a conversation with her team. She had already made some changes in her department, but this incident showed her that there was still more to be done. It wasn't just about changing policies or offering new training. It was about getting people to truly understand the deep-rooted biases that existed and how those biases impacted their interactions with others. After finishing her coffee, Maria decided to call a meeting with her closest colleagues. She needed their support, and more importantly, she needed their input. She wanted to make sure that the changes she was envisioning were possible and that everyone was on board. At the department, Maria gathered a few officers who she knew would understand the importance of the conversation. They sat in a small meeting room, and Maria took a deep breath before speaking. The room fell silent as she began. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened the other night," Maria started, her voice steady but serious. "And I realized that it wasn't just about me being stopped for a minor traffic violation. It was about how the situation changed when the officer realized who I was. That moment showed me something important, something that we all need to address." One of the officers, Officer Smith, spoke up. "What do you mean? Are you saying the officer treated you differently when he recognized you?" "Yes," Maria said. "It was subtle, but it was there. The moment he knew who I was, his behavior changed. He became nervous, hesitant. It made me wonder, how often does this happen, not just to me, but to others? And how often does it happen without us even realizing it?" The room was silent for a moment as the officers processed her words. Maria could see that they were beginning to understand what she was getting at. Officer Wright, who had been a vocal supporter of the changes Maria had initiated in the department, spoke up next. "I think we all know that biases are something we need to work on," Officer Wright said. "But it's not always easy to see them in ourselves. It's hard to confront things that we don't even realize we're doing." Maria nodded. "Exactly. That's why we need to have these tough conversations. We need to talk about our biases, both conscious and unconscious. We need to understand how they affect the way we do our jobs, how we interact with the community, and how we treat each other. If we want to truly change the system, we need to start by changing the way we think." The officers in the room nodded in agreement. Maria could feel the shift in the energy. This wasn't just a theoretical conversation anymore. This was real. They were all acknowledging that change needed to happen, and they were ready to be part of that change. "We've already started making changes in our training," Maria continued. "But we need to go deeper. We need to address the biases that exist in all of us, no matter how small or subtle. We need to be honest with ourselves and each other." Officer Hernandez spoke up. "So, what's the next step?" Maria thought for a moment. "I think it's time we implement some new initiatives. We need to bring in experts on bias training, not just for the officers, but for everyone in the department. We need to provide a space where people can talk openly about their experiences and where they can learn about how bias shows up in their actions." The group nodded in agreement. It wasn't going to be easy, but everyone understood that this was necessary. The department had already made strides in improving community relations, but this was the next step in building a more inclusive and understanding law enforcement system. As the meeting came to a close, Mariah felt a sense of accomplishment. The officers in the room weren't just agreeing with her, they were ready to take action. They understood the significance of the task ahead. This wasn't just about changing a few policies. It was about changing the culture within the department, one that would lead to real transformation. Weeks passed since the pivotal meeting, and while the journey toward change had just begun, Carla could feel the shift taking place in her department. There was a noticeable change in the air, a subtle yet significant difference in how officers were interacting with one another and the community. It wasn't as fast as she had hoped, but change was happening, and that alone gave her a sense of purpose. Every day, Carla worked hard to keep the momentum going. She knew that real transformation required time and effort. The department's leadership team had been receptive to her vision, but she was aware that lasting change wouldn't happen overnight. It was a slow process, and she had to keep pushing forward, even when there were setbacks. One afternoon, Carla sat at her desk, reviewing reports when her phone rang. It was Officer Wright, a dedicated member of the force who had been a vocal supporter of the new training initiatives. Carla had always trusted Officer Wright's judgment and valued her perspective. She answered the call. "Detective Williams," Officer Wright's voice came through the receiver. "I wanted to let you know that we've seen some real changes in the field. Officers are starting to take the new training seriously. I think the conversations we're having are making a difference." Carla felt a wave of relief wash over her. "That's great news, Officer Wright. I knew it would take time, but hearing this means we're on the right track." There was a pause before Officer Wright spoke again. "We've had some challenges, though. Not everyone is on board with the changes. There's still resistance, especially from some of the more senior officers. But I think we're moving in the right direction." Carla knew this wouldn't be easy. She had anticipated resistance, particularly from those who had been in the department for years and were used to the old ways of doing things. Change could be uncomfortable, especially for those who had been part of the system for so long. But Carla wasn't about to let that stop her. She had a vision for a department where fairness and equality were at the forefront, and she was determined to make it happen. "I understand, Officer Wright," Carla replied. "It's going to take time to break through those barriers, but we can't stop now. Every conversation, every training session is a step toward the change we want to see. We need to keep pushing, even when it feels like we're not making progress." After the call, Carla spent some time reflecting on the obstacles ahead. The resistance was expected, but it still felt discouraging at times. She thought about the bigger picture, though, about the officers who were starting to recognize their biases, the community members who were beginning to trust the department again. Those small victories meant everything to her. The following week, Carla held another meeting with her leadership team. She had noticed some of the senior officers were less engaged than they had been during the earlier discussions. She knew that getting everyone on board was crucial, so she made sure to bring the conversation back to the heart of the issue, why this was important, and how it would benefit everyone, from the officers to the community. "I know that change can be uncomfortable," Carla began, addressing the group, "but it's necessary. We've all seen how biases affect the way we interact with others, whether we recognize it or not. It's time to do better. It's time to lead by example and make sure we're holding ourselves accountable. The community is watching us, and they want to know that we care about them, that we see them as equals." One of the senior officers, Captain Gray, raised an eyebrow. "You really think we can change the way people think? I've been in this job a long time. I've seen a lot of things, and I'm not sure these kinds of changes can happen overnight." Carla met Captain Gray's gaze, feeling the weight of his words, but she wasn't about to back down. "It's not going to happen overnight, Captain. I understand that. But we have to start somewhere. We can't wait for the world to change around us. We need to be the ones leading that change. Every step forward, no matter how small, brings us closer to the future we want to create." There was a long silence in the room. Carla could tell that the conversation was making some of the officers uneasy, but she didn't mind. She wasn't looking for comfort. She was looking for commitment. She wanted them to understand that this wasn't just about training or rules. It was about making a real, lasting difference in the way the department operated. The days after the meeting were filled with a mixture of progress and setbacks. Carla knew that changing an entire department's mindset would take time, but it was beginning to feel like things were slowly starting to move in the right direction. Officers were becoming more open to the conversations about biases, and some were starting to take the new training seriously. But despite these positive signs, there was still resistance, particularly from the more seasoned officers who had been around for years. Maria had always believed that true change began with honest conversations, and this was exactly what she was trying to do. It wasn't just about teaching officers new skills. It was about helping them recognize the biases they might not have known they had. But even with all the work she was putting in, the path forward was still difficult. One afternoon, Carla was sitting at her desk when she got an unexpected visit from Officer Smith, one of the senior officers in her department. He had been one of the most vocal critics of the new changes, particularly the emphasis on addressing unconscious bias. "Detective, do you have a moment?" Officer Smith asked, his voice serious but not unfriendly. Carla set down the case files she had been reviewing and gestured for him to take a seat. "Of course, Officer Smith. What's on your mind?" He hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I've been thinking a lot about the training and the new initiatives we've been working on. I have to admit, I've been skeptical, but I've been listening, and I'm starting to see what you're trying to do. It's just, I'm not sure how well some of these changes are going to work in the real world." Carla nodded, understanding his concerns. She had expected resistance from some of the veteran officers, but hearing it from someone like Officer Smith, who had been with the department for so long, made her realize just how deep-rooted these issues were. "I get it," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "Change is never easy. It's uncomfortable, and it challenges the way we've been doing things for years. But we have to ask ourselves, are we doing enough to make sure everyone is treated equally? Are we doing enough to address the biases that shape our actions, whether we realize it or not?" Officer Smith sighed. "I don't think anyone's ever asked us to question ourselves this much. It feels like we're being told we've been doing everything wrong. But I do want to make things better. I just don't know if all of this will actually make a difference in the long run." Carla leaned forward, trying to emphasize the importance of the change they were working toward. "I understand. But the truth is, the old ways weren't working. If we want to build trust with the community, if we want to create a department where people feel safe and respected, we have to change. We have to be honest about our mistakes and learn from them. That's how we grow." There was a long pause as Officer Smith processed her words. Finally, he nodded. "I see what you mean. Maybe I've been resistant because it's uncomfortable, but I'll admit, I've learned a lot from the training so far. Maybe I just need more time to understand how all of this is going to play out." Carla smiled. "It's okay to feel unsure. Change doesn't happen overnight, and it's not going to be easy. But we're in this together. We have to keep talking about it, keep asking questions, and keep working to do better." As Officer Smith stood to leave, he turned back to Carla. "I appreciate you taking the time to listen. I'll try to approach this with an open mind moving forward." Maria watched him leave, feeling a small sense of victory. This conversation had been an important one, and it wasn't just about Officer Smith agreeing with her. It was about opening the door to future conversations. It was about breaking down the walls of resistance and replacing them with understanding. She knew that not every officer would come around as quickly, but this was a step in the right direction. Later that week, Carla noticed subtle changes in the way officers interacted with one another. There were more open discussions during the training sessions, and she saw officers speaking up more, acknowledging their biases and talking about how they could do better. It was a slow process, but it was happening. Carla was beginning to see the shift she had hoped for. But the road ahead was still long. There were still moments when old habits crept in, when biases went unchecked. Carla knew that no matter how much progress they made, it wasn't enough. She needed to keep pushing, keep encouraging her team to dig deeper and reflect on their actions. The work was hard, but it was worth it. Carla had always believed in the power of leadership to inspire change. She had believed that with patience and persistence, they could create a better future, not just for the department, but for the community they served. As the weeks passed, Carla could feel the shift within her department becoming more evident. Officers were beginning to open up to the changes she had fought for. What had once seemed like an impossible task, convincing her colleagues to fully embrace the importance of fairness and equality, was now starting to take shape. While the road to transformation was long, Carla could see that they were moving in the right direction. One of the key changes she had pushed for was increased communication. It wasn't just about revising training or changing procedures. It was about fostering a department-wide conversation where everyone felt comfortable discussing their challenges and perspectives. This new level of openness was slowly beginning to build trust among officers who had once been reluctant to speak up. Maria knew that the battle wasn't over yet. Resistance still lingered, particularly from some senior officers who had spent decades in the department and were hesitant to abandon old practices. But the small victories, the officers who were starting to think more critically about their biases, the community members who were beginning to engage with the department in more meaningful ways, gave her hope. One morning, Carla was greeted with an unexpected surprise. Officer Wright, who had been one of the most vocal supporters of the changes, walked into her office holding a stack of papers. "Detective," she began with a smile, "I wanted to show you something." Carla looked up from her work, intrigued. "What's this?" she asked. Officer Wright laid the papers down in front of her. It was a report detailing the progress of the new training initiatives, complete with feedback from officers across the department. The responses were overwhelmingly positive, with many officers acknowledging how much they had learned during the sessions. More importantly, the feedback showed a noticeable shift in the department's overall attitude toward understanding and addressing biases. "Look at this," Officer Wright said, pointing to one section of the report. "Officers are saying that the conversations about unconscious bias are helping them rethink their interactions with the community. They're seeing things in a new light. Some officers even suggested more in-depth follow-up sessions to keep the conversations going." Carla's heart lifted as she read through the feedback. She had hoped for progress, but seeing it reflected in the officers' words made it real. It wasn't just that they were checking boxes, it was that they were beginning to internalize the lessons and apply them in their daily work. This was the kind of change she had envisioned from the start. "This is incredible," Carla said, her voice filled with gratitude. "It's clear that people are starting to see the value in what we're doing. This is what we've been working toward." Officer Wright smiled. "We've made a lot of progress, but we still have a long way to go. There's still some pushback, but I think the next step is to continue these discussions and start involving the community more. The officers are open to it. They just need to keep hearing from people who can challenge their assumptions in a safe, constructive way." Carla agreed. "You're right. We need to make sure the changes aren't just internal. We need the community's voice in this too. If we're going to build trust, it's going to take collaboration." The conversation sparked an idea in Carla's mind. She had been thinking about ways to engage the community more directly, to create a space where both officers and residents could come together and have honest discussions about the challenges they faced. She had already started to build relationships with local leaders, and now it was time to take that next step. Over the next few weeks, Carla worked with her team to organize a community forum. The goal was to create an open space where residents could speak about their concerns and officers could listen, really listen. The forum would give community members a chance to talk about their experiences, and it would provide officers with a direct opportunity to hear the impact their actions had on the people they served. The event was a success beyond Carla's expectations. Community members spoke openly about their experiences, sharing stories of how they had been treated by law enforcement, both positively and negatively. Officers listened without interrupting, and there was a sense of mutual respect in the room. For the first time, there was a feeling that both sides were genuinely invested in understanding each other.